The French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, is a period rich with history and conflict, producing outcomes that are still visible today, as will be discussed. Although this war was a war between the French and the British, it was a conflict that consumed the Native Americans. This conflict, although primarily between two massive European nations, had its beginnings with one colonist named George Washington. In getting to the root of the conflict, we are going to explore the inception of the entanglement from a Virginia militia officer named George Washington and his campaign of 1754, which led to the death of a French lord by the name of Joseph Coulon de Viez. Washington was, at least in part, responsible for the death of the French lord, as he took the word of a native by the name of Tonagresson, who was nicknamed the Half-King. Tonagresson claimed the French were attacking, and rather than confronting some 30 Frenchmen as to their intentions, Washington chose to ambush them with a superior force. The skirmish would take some 15 minutes to conclude in the surrender of the French, and ultimately resulted in the Half-King killing the lord in cold blood. This act would go on to ignite a war between the French and the British, as forces swelled from the Old World into the American frontier. This incident is expanded on by Gilbert Dinn in his article published in the Louisiana History Journal, as he explains that Coulon's brother, Louis the half-brother of Joseph, sought revenge and would attack Fort Necessity on July 3, 1754, where he avenged his brother's death by having Washington sign a confession within the Articles of Capitulation, which Washington did not have full understanding of what was being signed. Although Washington was not executed, he was held to account for what the French believed were his decisions concerning their officer and a member of a distinguished French family. Washington's actions, or to better put it, his inaction against stopping the Half-King, had helped to ignite a conflict across the continent. British troops would soon cross the Atlantic, landing at the shores of Acadia, now known as Nova Scotia and located on Canada's eastern coast. The British began the expulsion of the French, beginning in 1755 and ending in 1764. Emptying the towns of all colonists and forcing them, with very little provisions, onto ships. In Joseph Amato's A Great and Noble Scheme, he notes that the Acadian diaspora pushed Acadians to various parts of the region, including Quebec, Maine, New Brunswick, and elsewhere within Canada. This populace had been in the region for more than a century, only to be uprooted as a means to establish a British territory. Many of these uprooted Acadians would choose to make their way to the Gulf Coast, occupying modern-day Louisiana. They became the Cajuns. George Washington's folly in his occupation of Fort Necessity and the attack on the French lord produced what would become known as the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. Secondly, his actions had additional unforeseen consequences, as it would lead ultimately to him being blamed for the entirety of the fiasco. Lastly, his actions in the Pennsylvania wilderness would lead to the expulsion of innocent men and women across the Acadian territory, moving them far from their homeland that had been well established. To think that a promoted lieutenant colonel caused this much trouble, it was inevitable he would cause even more when wearing the rank of general.